In this video, I'll be breaking down this coffee machine animation, and I'll be going into how to animate a fake 3D handle, particles, liquids, and so on. A major part of this animation is the handle itself and how it's rotating slightly in 3D space. If we take out this 3D rotation, you can see how much it actually added to the overall look and feel. Without the 3D rotation, the animation feels rather stiff. So how do we actually do this? Well, it seems like it's 3D, but actually it's all made in 2D. If we take a closer look at the composition with the handle itself, you can see that it's just a bunch of shape layers. And I have animated the position, scale, and path. So when we scrub through, you can see this rotation taking place in the x-axis. To explain this, it's actually much easier if I just take a handle or the portafilter that's used in the coffee machine and show you how it moves in 3D space. If we have the basket itself and we rotate from that point, you can see that it almost seems like the handle is becoming shorter. This is something called foreshortening. To properly execute this animation, we need to start all the way back in Illustrator where we have the design of the handle. If you want to follow along, you can go down to the description to purchase the project file for this entire animation. As you can see here, it basically consists of a bunch of rectangles connected to circles. And this is because we're working with a cylinder, so whenever this rotates, we're taking the circles and basically changing their scale and position. So if we break this apart, you can see that we have the end circle here, then the next part, ending up with the basket all the way here at the bottom. So creating the design in this way means that it's much easier to manipulate in terms of animation. The more complex you make the design, much more difficult it becomes to sort of fake this rotation. Now when we're looking at this, you have to imagine that we're looking at it at sort of a side view. And then whenever we rotate it, we will simply move these parts towards the center and shorten the rectangles like so, and this gives the illusion that it's actually rotating and we're making it shorter, meaning that we're creating that foreshortening effect. So you can see already right here, it looks like it's rotated a bit. Of course, the dimensions aren't exactly right, but this is the main idea behind this design. Another thing that we need to keep in mind is that when we're looking at it from the side here, the circles actually need to be squashed a tiny bit, and this goes for all of the circles. And this just shows the perspective that we're looking at it from the side. And then when we move it towards the center, so we're seeing it straight on, the circles will go back to their original shape. Another part that really sells this animation is the rotation of the basket itself. If we were to remove these tiny attachments, you can see that there really wouldn't be any sign that this would be rotating because there would be no moving elements. But because we have these small attachments, and if I just show it without it being masked, we can take this and move it from side to side whenever it's being rotated, and that way it just shows that the basket is rotating as well. So let's go into After Effects and recreate this animation. You can see that I've separated the handle into the different parts, and on top of that I've added a matte layer so I can cut out the sides of the attachments. We can do that right away by selecting the attachments. Then we'll toggle switches/modes if we haven't already. Pick whip from the attachments to the matte. And you can see that they are only being shown within that matte itself. So whenever we move them, they're cut off at the sides. Let's start out by actually adjusting the perspective of the circles. Right now, they are completely circular, meaning that we're seeing them straight on, but we want to see them a bit from the side because the handle is rotated to the left. So we'll start with the first one. Make sure that the anchor point is centered. If it's not already, you can press Y and simply drag it and it should snap to the center. If we press S as in scale, we can scale it down slightly. I think about 80% should be fine. And now you can see it actually has the right perspective. If we were to see the handle completely from the side, the circle would actually be at 0 in scale, but we still want to show a bit of it, so it's not rotated all the way. Let's repeat this for all of the other circles that are at the connecting parts of the handle. And we'll also add a keyframe while we're at it, so it's ready to be animated. Now, when this is done, we can actually start moving things around. So we have to keep in mind that we want to animate the handle moving or being shifted from this position to the center position, where we only see the circle, and then we can repeat that animation to the other side, just reversed. So we'll do this by animating the path of the rectangles as well as the position of the different parts of the handle. So let's select the handle parts, we can open them up, and then we want to find the paths for the rectangle. We can add a keyframe, and we just want to do that for all of them. Now when this is done, we can add a keyframe to the position of the handles as well. Press P and add the keyframe. And to show all of the different keyframes at once, we will select all of the layers, press U, and you can see that we have the scale, the path, and the position for all of the different parts. Here we also want to make sure that we have a position keyframe for the end circle. And now with all of the different keyframes visible, we want to go 1 second ahead. And this is where we'll animate that fake rotation. So we want to animate the handle towards us, so it's pointed directly at us, and therefore the circle is the only thing visible. And to do this, we want it to be centered in the basket, so the handle is no longer on the side. And we can do this by just selecting all of the layers, zooming in a bit, and then dragging it to the center. From here on, we want to create the foreshortening effect, and we can just start from the first part of the handle. So let's select this layer, and we want to work with the path. So we'll just deselect the rectangle and select these 2 points, and we want to drag them all the way into the center so the rectangle actually isn't visible anymore. And we will repeat this for the different parts. Now we're just left with a bunch of circles, and we want these to line up in the center of each other. But before we do that, we can adjust the scale again, so it's set to 100%, and this just applies for all of the different circles. Now we need a guide, so we actually position these in the center, and we can start out by selecting the basket, pressing Command and Control R to get the ruler, and we can just drag a guide out and get that straight in the center. This way we can line up the first circle here, so it should snap straight to it. Select the next one, make it snap, and just repeat this process for all of the different circles. This way, whenever you scrub through, you can see that we actually have the rotating handle animation. So it's actually quite simple, you just really need to understand how the 3D aspects work, and that way you can recreate them in 2D. So to move the handle to the other side, we need to sort of repeat this process. One way of doing this is going about it manually and dragging out the circles and trying to line everything up. But there's also a bit of a simpler way to do it, where we actually just take the handle itself and basically flip it. And to do this, we'll go Layer, New, Null Object, and we'll have to make sure that this is centered in the circle. And to do this, I'll basically just be copying the position, so the X and the Y values, and this way it's dead center. Then we can take all of the different parts of the handle. We'll make sure that we have the parent and link enabled, so we can parent them to the null. We'll just call this the control layer, and we can just turn this off again. And this way, whenever we move the null, all of these different parts move as well. But what we want to do is go 1 frame before it gets to the center. We'll press S as in scale and add a keyframe. And then when we get to the middle point, we'll just unlock the constraint proportions, and we'll go -100 in the X scale. This way we basically make it flip at the very center, and therefore we can go 1 more second ahead. Then we can copy and paste these initial keyframes, and that way we have the very same animation, but it's just on the other side. So we're basically just flipping it so we don't have to recreate everything from scratch. Now the final part here is animating the small attachments on the basket. Because right now you can see that when this is rotating, it looks kind of weird because the basket itself is not rotating. So we essentially have a still object and something rotating around it. That's not what we want. Now instead of going to the center of the animation, we can go to the very end, and then we can drag this along so it matches up just in the reverse order. And you can see that we have this rotating movement. One thing that's important here is of course that you have 3 of these attachments, because otherwise you won't have one appearing here on the side. And you also need to match up the movement of these with the handle itself. You can see it does that pretty well. And now when we play this back, you can see that we have the rotating movement. But as it is right now, it doesn't really seem that exciting. And that's just because this is a placeholder. This is a very basic movement, and then we can take that and apply it as a rotation in our main animation. So if we go back to the composition, we can see that we have the handle here, and it's just slowly rotating, and this doesn't look that great. But if we right-click the layer and go to time and enable time remapping, you can see that we have a keyframe for the start of the composition and the end of the composition. So this is basically the movement, and after that it just disappears. What we can do now is use these two keyframes to animate back and forth between that rotation, so we can rotate it however much we actually want to, and also apply some easing. As an example, here at the very start, we want the handle to be rotated in the other direction. So we know that this is at the 2-second mark, so we can just delete this second keyframe, go to 2 seconds, and now we have a keyframe at that particular rotation. And we want it to rotate all the way to the other side, and we know that's at 0 seconds of that composition, so we just add a keyframe to that. Then we can of course go ahead and add the different easing by pressing F9, adjusting the graph editor, so on and so forth. And you can see that we have that animation, and whenever we just want some slight rotation, we can always add a keyframe, go a bit ahead, and then just drag the time, and you can see that we have the rotation happening. So by doing this, we have a lot of control over our fake 3D rotation, and we can quickly apply it to our animation so it isn't that bland. And when we use that concept, you can see here in the main composition with the time remap, and we have the value graph showing, you can just see that it indicates whether it's rotated all the way to the right or all the way to the left. And as it goes through the animation, you can see we have some slight rotation back and forth here to create some life. So it's not just as static. And then again, it goes all the way to the right at the very end. Let's take a look at how to animate the coffee bean particles. As you can see in this composition, we have the bean hopper with the beans slowly lowering, and we have the particles actually falling down into the portafilter. So to start out, we'll take a look at the particles. In this blank composition, you can see that we just have the beans moving. And to create the particles, we'll start out by going to Layer, New, Solid. And we'll make sure that this is the color of the particles. And we can just call this layer Particles as well. Now this will cover up the entire screen, but we'll go ahead and add an effect. And this is called Particle Systems 2. Drag that onto the layer. And now you can see that it disappears. But whenever we drag through the timeline, you can see that the particles go a bit wild. So we'll have to adjust some settings. We can go down into the physics at the very start. And this is an explosive animation, meaning that it will explode to all sides. What we want is for gravity to actually control it, so it's just particles falling. So we can select the explosive and change that to direction. And now we'll have to turn down the velocity. This controls the speed that it's moving at, but we only want gravity to affect it. So we'll set this to 0. And now you can see it's just falling down in a straight line. So if we play it back, you can see it's maybe falling a bit too fast. This of course depends on the weight of the particles falling. If it's very heavy, it will of course fall faster. And if it doesn't weigh that much, it will fall slower because of gravity. So we'll take the gravity control, maybe set it to 0.3. And I think this should be about fine. But this sort of looks like yellow and orange rice grains, which is not something that we want. So we'll have to change the particles themselves. The particle right now is a line. And I think if we select the lens convex, we'll get something that comes closer to grinded coffee. Right now it's really big, so it sort of looks like a slop. But of course we can change that with the birth and death size. We don't really want it to become smaller or bigger as time progresses, so we'll need these two values to be the same. If we turn down the birth size, you can see it becomes a lot smaller. And we can copy and paste this to the death size as well. And we'll just have to figure out where this has to lie. Maybe 0.04 should be good. You can also see that these particles differ in opacity. We can change this by selecting the opacity map and choosing constant. and we just want it to be 100%. So now we have these solid particles and we just need to line them up with the grinder. We can select them and drag them in the grinder. Right now they are on top. So I can just show all of the different layers, and we'll just have to drag them all the way down around here. And we can just hide those again. From here, we can select where they are spawning from. So it needs to be roughly in the center of this grinder. And we can go to the producer itself. And this is where we control the scale of the producer, because right now they are clumped together in the center and we want to spread them out a bit. And this is done using the X radius. So if we drag that out, you can see that it actually fits with this grinder itself. We can also see that maybe we want to adjust some of these settings. Right now, there's maybe a bit too much space between the particles. The particles are maybe a bit too small. So we can go into the particle again. In this, you can also see that we have a size variation. And this just means that we can either have equal particles or have them vary in scale. And we can drag this out a bit to our liking. Maybe we want the particles to be a bit larger, like this. So they are clumped a bit together at certain points, and there's a bit of air at other points. The last thing that we can alter with is now the birth rate and the longevity. So the longevity basically means for how long they are visible or alive. Right now they're falling way past the basket in our portafilter, so we need to decrease this. And as we do so, at a certain point you can see that they start to disappear. So just above the basket right here should be fine. You can see some of the particles fall out, so maybe we need to adjust it a little bit. Turn down the X radius as well. And you can see that we have the falling particles. Right now it takes some time for them to speed up because we have set the spawn point right above the grinder. So if we basically just take it and move it up a bit further, you can see that they have a bit more speed as they actually appear. And now we need to decide how many particles we want, and this is done using the birth rate. So the higher this is, the more particles. And this is also something that can be animated. So the things that we want to animate is the birth rate of the particles as well as the X radius. And if we take a look at the main animation again, we can just look at the keyframes. And here you can see that I've animated the birth rate, and I've done this with hold keyframes, just meaning that it holds that specific value until the next keyframe. And if we take a look here, at first, they're spawning quite a few particles, and then it drops almost to 0. And you can see this in this air gap, and it's just going a bit back and forth, so it's not a constant. This just makes it a bit more natural. And at the same time, I've animated the X radius, and this just means that the particles become a bit narrower at certain points, so they move in and out. And you can see that this reaction is a bit delayed to the keyframes because the particles have to fall. But at first, they are quite wide in terms of where they're spawning, and then they narrow in and go wide again. And the last part here is just adding those grinded coffee beans to the basket itself. So as the particles fall, this will fill up. And this is a very simple animation. This is just done using a simple Y position, so it moves up. And then there's a bit of a change in the path, just so it looks a bit more natural. And if you want the different coffee particles to clump together a bit, you can do that by going to the particles and adding a simple choker effect. And you can see that this just clumps them together a bit more. And at the very end, we have the bean hop, where we just have the beans falling down. This is also a very simple animation. So if we take a look in that pre-comp, you can just see that there's some simple keyframes here. It's just from A to B. And we basically just have all of the coffee beans moving down, and they are all inside of this mat, meaning that they don't go outside of the edges. We have them just moving down, and we also have some slight rotation on the different beans at the top here and the highlights and the shadows, just so it looks like they're actually falling down towards the center. And this is a very smooth animation. It's not very typical for a bean hop. It would be more of a mechanical movement, a bit more rattling. And the way that we achieve this is simply by taking these beans, and then we'll add an effect called posterize time. And this basically changes the frame rate. So the overall frame rate of this animation is 24 frames per second. So if you want something to be a bit more mechanical or a bit more jagged, you usually lower the frame rate. So we have just lowered it to 12 frames per second. And this just changes the animation from something rather smooth to something that fits more in this sort of style. Liquid is always really interesting when it comes to animation, especially if you want to simplify it. Here we have the espresso liquid pouring out of the portafilter, and you can see it's quite dynamic, and because of that you can actually see that the liquid is moving. The problem that people can have with liquid, especially when animating it, is that if you don't add this sort of displacement or change in color, you can't see that it's actually moving. It just becomes something still. Actually, there's this phenomenon called laminar flow, and it's whenever water flows so perfectly that you can't see any movement in it, and then it becomes unnatural. And this is also something that sometimes happens in animation. So let's take a look at how we can create something a bit more natural. And especially when it comes to coffee or espresso, I also want to exaggerate the pull here. So it's almost like it has this syrupy sort of texture that it sticks to the basket before falling. And of course, water wouldn't do this. Coffee doesn't do it to this extent, but sometimes in animation, you have to exaggerate it to really sell the effect. So you can see it sticks a bit here as it falls, and then it moves up again. So let's start out with this shape. This is just the very basic shape of the coffee falling down. It's sticking a bit to the top, and this will be our starting point. So we'll select this path, and you can basically see that it just consists of these 4 different points, and we just have the anchor points dragged all the way out to really exaggerate this curve. We'll select the path, go to Window, scroll all the way down, and we'll find this effect called Create Nulls from Paths. From here, we'll select the points follow nulls, and this will just create a null for each individual path point. So whenever we move one around, you can just see that it moves the path point. And this makes it a lot easier to actually animate the liquid falling down. So we'll select the 2 bottom points, press P as in position, and we can just right click these 2 and separate the dimensions. At first, we'll just be looking at the Y position and drag this keyframe out a bit. Then here at the start, we can drag it all the way up so it's not visible. And you can just see that the liquid is falling down. Right now, it's pretty slow and we don't have any easing. So we'll start out by adjusting the timing, pressing F9 to add easy ease. Now the reason why this liquid is falling is gravity, and therefore it will also accelerate as time moves on. We'll take the endpoint here and we'll just make sure that we have the value graph selected. Just deselect this and drag it all the way down, exaggerate this a bit. And when we take a look at this, it just means that there's no movement at the start, and then slowly it starts to accelerate more and more. Now, when this is done, we can go ahead and actually animate the path itself. Right now, it's not possible to actually move any of the points because there's this expression enabled, which makes the nulls control the path itself. But we can just disable the expression, and now all of a sudden, we actually have access to the different path points. One thing you need to keep in mind here, though, is that whenever you turn on the expression again, the path points will move to their original position, which is connected to the null. Because of this, we won't be able to actually animate the position of the path points, but instead of that, we'll be able to actually animate the handles, because whenever we turn on the expression again, they will remain in that position. So what we'll do here is that we'll go to the very start and we'll add a keyframe for the path. And then we'll go a bit further than the null position animation and add another keyframe. At the very start, we want to exaggerate this shape. So we'll take the handles here and we'll just drag them all the way down and drag these in. So we almost have this triangular shape. Whenever we then turn on the expression again, you can see that this has changed the animation quite a bit. Now, instead of it just falling, you can see that we have this path actually moving at the same time. At this moment, it looks a bit weird because the easing is not right. But if we take these 2 keyframes, press F9 to easy ease, and then we just want it to happen a bit later, and we'll have to play around with the easing for this and the timing a bit to get it perfect. But then when we play it, you can see that the effect we're looking for is it almost sticking and then moving up here towards the end. So let's see what we can do with the easing. And right here, I think we found the perfect balance. The thing is that we have two different animations and they need to overlap perfectly because we are playing with both the position of these path points as well as the handles. And you can see when we get that timing just right, we have it falling down, it sort of feels like it's sticking, and then towards the end, it's moving up. So this one is a bit more art than science. You have to tinker a bit to get it perfect, but when you do, the result will also be a lot better. The problem that we now encounter is that we have the start of the animation, we can see that the liquid is falling, but after that, it's just still. We have no movement actually indicating that the liquid is still flowing and it's not just a solid block. So to get this movement, we will work with some wiggle expressions. We can go ahead and select all of the nulls, press P, and we'll just separate the dimensions for these two as well, because we will be wiggling the X position. So we can start with this bottom one, just Alt or Option click the stopwatch, type in wiggle. Then we have to type in two different variables. First of all, the frequency and then the amplitude. The frequency decides how fast it wiggles. So the higher the number, the more frequent it wiggles. And the amplitude decides by how much. So the higher the amplitude is, the more it's actually moving. For this, I think that we will maybe go with a pretty low number for the frequency because we want sort of a smooth flowing motion. So something like 1.2. And then for the amplitude, we want a bit more movement, but again, we don't want it to move at an extreme level. So maybe something like 8. Can just enter that. And as you can see, this is the bottom right null. And right now it's moving in and out. So we can actually right click and we can copy this expression and just paste it to the other X positions. And all of a sudden you can see that we have a lot more motion in the liquid itself. Now this is a starting point and we still need to add a bit more to really sell this effect. So if we go into the composition again, you can see that it already works pretty well here. Something I've quickly done is just add a scale animation, mainly to scale down the liquid at the very end, just so it disappears. And this seemed to be the easiest way to do it instead of actually animating it from the top and down to disappear. To really sell this, we can add a final effect called Wave Warp. So if we go to Effects and Presets, just search for Wave Warp. We can drag that onto our liquid animation. And right now you can see it looks a bit strange. This is because the wave is actually moving horizontally and not vertically. So we can go ahead and change the direction to -180. But still it looks a bit strange because we don't want the wave to appear all the way at the top. Good thing is that the liquid composition itself has been cropped. So we have the liquid touching the top edge. And because of this, we can pin it. So if we go to pinning and we select the top edge, you can see that the waving is cut off at the top. And now, of course, we need to adjust the settings so it doesn't look this extreme. First of all, we can adjust the wave height and the width. The height is, well, the height of the wave and the width sort of stretches it out. So we'll go for something quite small, maybe 0.7. And for the width, we'll stretch it out quite a bit. So I'm thinking something like 200, and we can play this back. Right now, it seems maybe a bit too slow for liquid sort of pouring down. So we can increase the speed to 3. And then you can see that the liquid is looking a lot more natural as it's flowing. And you can, of course, go ahead and adjust all of these settings to your liking, also depending on the density of the liquid. Is it syrup flowing down? Is it water? Of course, this will alter how it's supposed to look. And as a final touch, you can add the coffee to the glass. This is just a simple Y position and it's matted out to the inside of this glass. And I've also added two different wave warp effects and they just decrease towards the very end. So you can see it's displacing a bit and then it becomes still as no more liquid is flowing down. The movement of liquid can be quite difficult to get just right, but whenever you do, it really helps to ground your animation in reality. If we take a look at this example, it's quite subtle, but the liquid is reacting to the movement of the glass. And just to show you how much this does for the animation, I have a version where it's disabled. And you can see all of a sudden it doesn't seem like liquid anymore because it's not reacting how it would in the real world. One thing that's quite important to understand is that whenever you have a glass filled with liquid and you start to rotate it, it seems like the liquid is leveling out to the ground beneath you. And this is because of gravity. If you do this movement fast, the liquid will have to catch up because of inertia. So using these two different principles, it's actually much easier to animate our liquid whenever the glass is moving. If we take this animation as an example, we can start at the very first rotation keyframe of the glass, add a rotation keyframe to the liquid itself, then move to the next one, and all we have to do is level out the liquid. So if we rotate it, we can do this by eye, so you can see it's leveled out according to the ground, and this is the exact same principle that I just showed you with the water in the glass. So if we move on to the next rotation keyframe, you can see we have to level out in the other direction, and we just have to repeat this for all of the different rotation keyframes for the glass. So this should be the last one, and you can see now we have it leveled out. We can go ahead and add some easy ease to these keyframes, and this easing should just match up to the easing of the rotation of the glass itself, which you can see that it does right here. And now if we go through the animation, it already looks a lot better. But there's just one slight issue, and this is the inertia that I mentioned. Because we have the fast movement with the glass, the liquid needs time to catch up. So actually we need to delay this animation a little bit. So we can take all of the keyframes for the liquid animation and just offset them by 2 frames. And now you can see it seems a lot more natural because the liquid is trying to catch up with the movement of the glass. This is a very simple way to sell the effect that we actually have liquid in the glass. Instead of spending a lot of time doing wave warp and different effects, you can actually get away with something a lot more subtle. When you really need to sell an animation, it's often done in the details and the subtleties. So when we take a look at this project, as an example, we have the tamper coming down and tamping the coffee right here. And if we take a look at the portafilter itself, you can see that we have this clean motion path and there's no downward movement at this particular point. And actually it would also be a bit difficult to do because you would have to break up this motion path to create that Y position animation. So what I like to do if I need to interrupt another animation and layer some more movement on top is use a null object. As you can see, I have the null object right here and I parented both the portafilter and the tamper to it. So if we press U, you can see it's just a simple position animation where it moves down as it's getting tamped and then it goes back up again. But this is just a way to add additional animation without breaking the original motion path. Another example of a detail is the movement of the machine itself. As you can see, as the portafilter is coming out, the machine slants slightly towards the left as it's reacting to that movement. And also when the beans are being grinded, you can also see that the machine sort of bobs up and down. And at the very end, as the portafilter attaches again, there's this slight movement in the machine. And of course, this wouldn't happen in real life, but often in animation, if we exaggerate certain things, it just feels a lot better and a lot more coherent. So I've done this first of all by adding an effect to the machine called CC Slant. And I've just set the anchor point to the bottom of the machine. And as you can see here at the very start, I have then animated that slant, which is slanting the machine back and forth, to just slightly go left and then settle as the portafilter moves out. And also towards the end, as it attaches, it's just sort of dragging the machine to the right and then settles again. Now for the grinding of the coffee beans, where the machine sort of bobs up and down, I've done this using very simple scale keyframes, again with the anchor point set to the bottom of the machine. You can just see that it scales up and down ever so slightly, and to make this a bit more random, I've adjusted the timing and just decreased the scale at certain points and increased it at others. And to really get that squash and stretch feel, you can see that whenever the X scale is scaling up, the Y scale is scaling down. And this is just to retain the volume of the object, because if, let's say, I were to set this to 105, in the X scale, but just leave the Y scale at 100, you can see that the machine seems a bit off because the volume is not retained. But if I were to decrease the Y scale, you can see that this is more in line with the original volume if I were to set it to 100, 100. So this is just the way that squash and stretch works. The most important thing to keep in mind whenever you're doing these sort of animations for social media is that it loops properly. The thing is that whether you're on TikTok, Instagram Reels, anything like that, the way that the video player is set up is that whenever it's done playing, it just loops again. So you want something seamless. In this animation, you can see that the coffee is being pulled, glass moves out, and it starts over again. So there's a few considerations that I kept in mind to actually make this work. First of all, whenever you need something to loop, it needs to end at the exact same frame that it starts at. So you can see here at the very end, the glass moves out and we have the portafilter again attached to the machine. And if we go to the very start, this is the exact same frame. Something you may not have noticed is that whenever the coffee beans are being grinded right here, the actual amount of beans decreases, so it moves down. And also whenever the shot is being pulled, you can see that the water decreases as well. So this is something to keep in mind whenever you need to go back to the initial starting point. The way that I've done this is just by subtly towards the end, just increasing the volume of both of them as the glass is moving. And because of the fact that the glass is quite big, it's moving fast, it's taking all of the attention, so you most likely don't even notice that the water and the beans are going back to their initial level. And because of this, the transition to the start just seems very seamless. So by moving the glass, I actually redirect the attention of the viewer, and they most likely don't even notice that there are any changes happening in the background. And another great thing about this glass animation is that it moves towards the left, which means that it's sort of pulling that motion in that direction. And at the very start, we continue that directional pull by moving the portafilter towards the left as well. And that way it becomes seamless because we continue that motion from the end of the animation to the very start. And this is also a way of hiding the start and end point. I hope that you learned something new from this breakdown. If you want to dive even further into it, you can go down to the description and purchase the project file. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to leave a like, post a comment down below if you have any questions, and make sure to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications if you want to get notified when I upload future videos. That's all for this time, until next one.